people of Holland have a saying, God made the earth, but Holland was made by the Dutch. And certainly they're the only people to build an airport on the site of a naval battle. The battle took place in 1573, just about where I'm standing now, between the Dutch and the Spanish fleets, when all this was covered by about 15 feet of seawater. Ever since then, generations of Dutch engineers have drained and diked the area, and now there are 560 miles of underground pipes to keep the runways dry. But as a reminder of the ships that came to grief here, the airport is called Schiphol, the ship's grave. Like its airport, Amsterdam is built in a strange place. The ground is marshy and the area has no natural advantages. But the early Amsterdammers were determined to make their town a success, and today it's the capital of all the Netherlands. The quickest way to get to know the city is by boat. There are guided tours by water bus, or you can hire a boatman, rather like taking a taxi. My taximan was Mr. Kees de Rover, and he answered my questions in a lovely mixture of English and double Dutch. Kees, how did Amsterdam get its name?
Well, Amsterdam got its name, more or less, the river was floating down here to that way, and they start building the town. After about 200 years, it became a town. And
what is the name of the river?
The river is the Amstel.
Ah. I gathered a dam was built here across the river, and Amsterdam was soon shortened to its present form. Amsterdam. The dam didn't only give the town its name, it also brought prosperity and trade. Boats coming down the river had to unload their cargoes at the dam, so they could be transferred into seagoing ships on the other side. The local people took advantage of this. They built warehouses and set up shipping companies. They designed the bridges with a lifting section so that even the biggest barges could reach the town centre. Traffic on the river increased all the time, until in the 17th century the people of Amsterdam found another way to benefit from their town's marshy site. They began to dig canals, laying them out just like streets. At each intersection they put up an arched bridge, rather like a pedestrian crossing in a normal city. Altogether they excavated 100 canals, with a total length of 54 miles, and built over 1,000 bridges. The plan they followed was simple. From the banks of the Amstel, the canals swung out in wide crescents until they reached the harbour in the north. When they were completed, everyone could reach their house by boat. At the same time, the city was made more attractive as lines of elm trees were planted to strengthen the canal banks. The Amsterdam Town Council was so proud of its new waterway system that for a time it banned all wheel traffic from the town. Visitors had to leave their carts and carriages in one of the large parking squares and then continue by boat. It's a pity this rule didn't last. Nowadays, the canal banks have become the parking places and lines of cars crowd along the water's edge. A few years ago, safety rails were installed here to stop the cars falling in. Too many people were forgetting to check the handbrake and came back to find their cars in 9 feet of water. Another kind of congestion has appeared on the canals themselves. Amsterdam has over 2,000 houseboats of every shape and size. Some are kept immaculately with their own neat rooftop gardens of potted plants. Then there are dozens of old cargo barges. They're used as camping boats by the hundreds of young people and students who come to Amsterdam each summer. There are quite a few eccentrics. This gentleman looked rather like Robinson Crusoe. And on the Prince's Canal is a boat that can only be described as a floating farm, with a deckload of animals and poultry. But amidst all the scramble for mooring and parking places, one canal bank is still reserved for the stallholders of the Amsterdam flower market. The Dutch love fresh flowers, so this is always a splash of colour, whatever the time of year. Case, why are all the front doors up steps? I mean, there isn't one that's on ground floor level, is there?
Well, one way has to do with the water, and the other way has to do with taxes.
If the ground floor wasn't a few steps up, the cellar would be underwater. And a double flight of steps was a sign of wealth, because steps were taxed in the 17th century. One flight was for the family, and the other was used by tradesmen. Case then pointed out various symbols on the houses. These were the trademarks of the people who lived there, and on the public buildings he showed me the Amsterdam city crest, 3 crosses in a line. I also noticed the gable designs. The earliest was stepped, but later funnel and neck-shaped gables became the most popular. Nearly all these canal-side houses were built by merchants and were designed as home, office and warehouse all in one. That's why on each gable end there's a hoisting beam, which was used to lift goods up to the attic storerooms. Nowadays, most of the houses have been converted into flats or offices. But Case and I saw one of the hoisting beams still being used for moving furniture. It's much easier to get a piano delivered this way than have it manhandled up 3 flights of narrow stairs. By now I was keen to see what the inside of these houses looked like, and Case told me that in the Ouderzijds Voorburgwal there was one open to the public. The Voorburgwal is right in the centre, the first canal to be dug in Amsterdam, and the merchant's house I was going to look at was over 300 years old. I can see why they needed a hoisting beam. The staircases here are much steeper than in Britain. Even with nothing to carry, it's quite difficult to keep your balance. I'd come up into what was the front bedroom of the house. The bed's been taken away, but it used to fold up into the large cupboard in the corner. The house is full of beautiful objects, like this single-handed clock. Rich Amsterdammers also had a passion for oil paintings, especially portraits. But the real works of art in this merchant's house are hidden away up in the attic. There's nothing unusual about the attic stairs, but when you get to the top, you find yourself in a church. It seems longer than the house below, and it is. It takes up the top 3 floors of the merchant's house, and also 2 smaller houses behind. But it's got everything a real church needs, with lines of wooden pews, and even a tiny organ. The only thing that seems to be missing is a pulpit, and that's because of an ingenious space-saving idea. When the priest wanted to deliver his sermon, all he did was take hold of this lever. Then he could swing out the pulpit from a hidden cavity underneath the altar. I imagine he wouldn't have taken as long as I did. There's probably a knack to pulpit swinging, and I don't think that I'd mastered it. But the great mystery is why the church was built here at all, tucked away in someone's attic. The 3 houses were built in 1661 by a man called Jan Hartmann. He lived in the front one himself and rented off the other 2. He and his family were Roman Catholics, and at that time there were deep religious divisions in Europe. The city of Amsterdam wanted to be as tolerant as possible, but even here Catholics were not allowed to worship openly. So when Jan designed his houses, he planned a secret church at the top, so that his family and friends could come to services quite safely. And because of its strange position, with its view out across the rooftops, it was known as Our Lord in the Attic. 1 or 2 members of the town council knew of Jan's secret, but they agreed to say nothing. They wanted Amsterdam to be the city where anyone could seek refuge. That's why they helped some Jews to build their synagogue here around about the same time. They'd been driven out of Portugal, but here in the Dutch city they were made welcome and left free to worship as they wished. Many of the Jews were merchants in diamonds, and they set up workshops on the banks of the Amstel. They were so successful that Amsterdam soon became the diamond capital of the world. First, the stones are sorted into different sizes and colours. Then they're polished and shaped to give them their sparkle. Ever since they came here from Portugal 300 years ago, the Jews have been masters of this delicate skill.
The Jewish people were always made welcome by the Dutch, but even here they were not to escape persecution. 30 years ago, during the Second World War, the troops of Nazi Germany conquered the Netherlands and occupied Amsterdam. They brought with them the inhumane ideas of their leader Adolf Hitler and began to attack the Jews. Confiscated their property, threw them into prison, and finally sent them in cattle trucks to the concentration camps in Germany. There, many of them were put to death in the gas chambers. The Dutch people were horrified by this cruelty, and many of them protested. This statue is a memorial to Amsterdam dockers who refused to work for the Germans because of what they were doing to the Jews. As a punishment, they too were sent to the death camps.
The ill treatment of the Jews was all the more saddening because many had fled here from Germany. Amongst them was a businessman called Otto Frank. He brought with him his wife and 2 teenage daughters, Margot and Anne, and got a job in a small factory on one of the quieter canals. For a while he thought his family was safe, but when war began and the Germans overran Holland, he knew it was only time before they would all be taken away to the concentration camps. Their only chance was to hide, and Mr. Frank knew of an excellent hiding place. He told his wife and the girls to pack a few things. It wasn't safe to be seen in the streets with a suitcase, so they all wore as many clothes as possible. Anne packed her books and her curlers into her school satchel to avoid suspicion. Then they made their way here to Mr. Frank's office, where he told them to climb the steep staircase to the top floor. Margot and Anne had no idea where they were going or why. Mr. Frank had thought it unfair that they should be asked to keep such a dangerous secret from their friends at school. He led them in here into what seemed to be a tiny box room. Then he took hold of this bookcase, which was full of files, pulled it back, and revealed a secret stairway that led up to 4 attic rooms at the back of the house that hardly anyone knew about. Just as Jan Hartmann had built a secret church in his attic, Otto Frank had discovered a secret annex to hide in till the war was over. Another family, the Van Daans, and a Jewish dentist called Mr. Dussel were to hide here too. And Mr. Frank warned them all there would be many problems. In the factory below, people were still working, so any noise during the day would betray them. They could cook their meals on the old stove, but they could only use the lavatory in the evenings, when there was no one downstairs to hear the sound of it flushing. Anne was horrified. She was a lively girl who liked to make plenty of noise. Only a few weeks before, it had been her 13th birthday. There'd been a party, and she and her friends had gone to see the film The Wonder Dog, Rin Tin Tin. There'd been lots of presents too, flowers and chocolates and books. Now Anne realized that there'd be no more parties, no cinema, no flowers or chocolates for a long time. All she had left were her books.
Her favourite book was one like this. It was full of blank pages and had been a present from her parents. The idea was to use it as a diary, and Anne was thrilled. She began it straight away and wrote, "No one will be interested in the unbosomings of a 13-year-old schoolgirl, but I want to write." And she did, keeping her diary faithfully for the next 2 years. What she wrote in it was so moving that a film was made about it called The Diary of Anne Frank. This is Anne's bedroom today. She had to share it with Mr. Dussel, the dentist, but she was determined that it was really her room. She stuck pictures from magazines around the walls to brighten it up a bit, and her pin-ups are still here today, a bit faded after 30 years. Here is a picture of Princess Margaret and Princess Elizabeth, now Queen Elizabeth II. They were about the same age then as Anne and her sister. She also amused herself by drawing up a prospectus for the annex, pretending that it was a sort of hotel. A temporary residence, open all the year round, with free board and lodgings. But often she would just sit at the window all day, half listening to the old carillon of the nearby Westerkirk striking the quarter hours. At night time, even that was quiet. In the evenings, Anne wrote in her diary, "It's the silence that frightens me so."
It was in the evenings, too, that Anne would join the others around the radio set, hoping to hear good news of the war on the BBC Overseas Service.
A few hours ago, watchers on Britain's southeast coast saw large formations of Allied aircraft pass overhead, heading for France. Formations of fighters went out first.
Then on June the 6th, 1944, D-Day, the British and American armies landed in Normandy. For the first time, it looked as though the Germans might be driven out of Holland. Anne pinned this old school map on the wall and began to mark the line of the Allied advance. On July the 21st, she wrote in her diary, "Now I am getting really hopeful. Now things are going well at last. Yes, really, they're going very well."
But 2 weeks later, Anne heard the sound she had always dreaded. It was the German police patrol.
Anne was escorted downstairs with the others, hustled into the van and taken to the station. There they were all put on a train for Germany. Tragically, it was the very last convoy of Jews to leave Amsterdam before it was liberated by the Allied troops. Only Mr. Frank survived the concentration camp. Anne died in March 1945, only 2 months before peace was achieved. When Mr. Frank returned to Amsterdam after the war, his Dutch friends told him that they'd rescued some papers from the annex after it had been ransacked by the German troops. Amongst them was Anne's diary. Mr. Frank read it with amazement. He knew only too well the horror and misery that his young daughter had endured for the last 2 years of her life. And yet her diary was full of hope for the future. He decided to publish it so that the whole world could read the brave words that she had written.
In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. If I look up into the heavens, I think that it will all come right, that this cruelty will end, and that peace and tranquility will return again. The mechanical street organs of Amsterdam are a constant delight to visitors. They seem to be everywhere, earning their living from passers-by rather like buskers in Britain. The holes in the card let air through to work the pipes, drums and puppets. Something else that's characteristic of the city is the tram system. It's completely self-service, so I had to get my ticket from a slot machine at the tram stop. Oh well. Obviously something's not right here. When the tram had come to a halt, one of the other passengers pressed a button to open the doors, and we all got on, only to find another machine. This time a date stamp to cancel the ticket. All this gadgetry is designed to make the service fast and frequent with as few staff as possible. There are no conductors, and I was interested to see that our tram was driven by a woman. The big difference between driving a tram and a bus is that at road junctions a tram has to negotiate points. I watched how our driver slowed down at each junction. Then, if the points were set the wrong way, she pressed a button to change them by sending an electric charge down through the rails. Each tram is made up of 2 or 3 carriages, and this means there's a surprise waiting for anyone who sits over one of the articulated joints. Suddenly you find your feet moving around beneath you, which is quite an odd feeling the first time it happens. But this system of double articulation does mean that the tram can be extra long and can take up to 250 people at a time. The tram routes, like the canals, all lead northwards to the old harbour front, today the site of the railway station. The modern port lies beyond, and because of extensive land drainage, it's now a full 20 miles from the sea, connected by the North Sea Ship Canal. But this doesn't worry Amsterdam. The ship canal is big enough for large ocean liners, and the port has no tides, a big advantage for shipbuilding and repairs. It's another example, rather like the drainage of Schiphol Airport, of the Dutch flair for getting round problems. And this dates back to their very first trading ventures. It's never been the most obvious place for a major port. In the 16th century, when Amsterdam first began to grow, London, Antwerp and Hamburg were all in a much better geographical position. The Dutch merchants were aware of this and realized it would be difficult to capture trade inside Europe. But this didn't discourage them. Instead, they looked overseas. Over there on the old harbour front is a large warehouse which was the headquarters of the Dutch West India Company. In Dutch, it was called the Geoctroieerde West-Indische Company, and it traded with North America. It bought an island called Manhattan from the Red Indians for just 60 guilders, and built there the town of New Amsterdam, which is now the city of New York. At the same time, from a warehouse next door, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, the East India Company, was even more enterprising. It sent expeditions to South Africa, China and New Zealand. It also colonized the Spice Islands of Indonesia, and that's why, 300 years later, Indonesian restaurants are one of the great attractions of Amsterdam. Their speciality is called Reichstafel. That looks marvelous.
Have a nice meal.
And can I choose from all these other dishes as well?
Yeah, you can have everything you want. Just put on the rice, the bun.
I don't think I can possibly eat it all. Well, what are some of the other dishes?
Fried banana, chicken in soy sauce, fried coconut, cabbage, cauliflower, bean sprout and peanut sauce, stream bread, fruit salad, green beans, salt beef, sour cucumber, sweet and sour vegetable, soybean, pork and peanut sauce, hot sauce, butternut bread, mushrooms, and shrimps in hot sauce. Enjoy your meal.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Altogether, there were 19 dishes to choose from, and each one looked as delicious as the next. I decided that if anyone ever succeeded in eating a complete rice staffel, they wouldn't need any more meals for a week. The next day, I'd planned to explore the outskirts of Amsterdam, so I thought I'd get a bit of exercise by hiring a bike. Cycling is very popular in Holland, and I soon discovered why. There are no hills, so you never have to get off and push. Cyclists are well looked after too, with their own cycle tracks, and even cycle traffic lights on the main roads. It didn't take me long to get out into the open country. I'd come here to see something else the Amsterdam merchants found on their voyages around the world. You couldn't eat it or wear it, but the Dutch knew there would always be a market for something as beautiful as the tulip. So they set about growing bulbs in a big way. Then I saw a strange thing. Workers were tearing the heads off a crop of hyacinths and throwing them into a basket. I know that if flowers are to keep well, they must be carefully cut. So I went to have a word with the owner of the field, Mr. Faber. He explained that of course he would cut them near the ground if he were growing bulbs for their flowers so the flower would live as long as possible. But his firm wasn't in business to grow flowers.
We are bulb growers, and that's why we cut them right here. Then the bulb is growing right away. As soon as the flower is on it, off it, then the bulb is going to grow.
I see. And what do you do with their
So
flower heads?
The heads we throw away.
Just wasted.
We are no flowers growers, we are bulb growers, you know.
However, there were some rather special flowers in the greenhouse. Oh, these are beautiful. And these are all new varieties in here, are they, Mr.
Everyone
Lefebvre?
a new one.
Lovely. What are they called? What is this one?
That's a lily flowering. It has not the name. This is it, not yet.
Oh, I see. Some
It's
of them are
quite
not
new,
named.
quite
Does this
new.
one have a name?
That is a dreaming maid, we call it.
Mr. Lefebvre told me that he'd produced all these wonderful new breeds by cross-pollinating one flower with another. How do you do it? How do you do the crossing?
Well, I can show you. From this one, that is a very strong stem and a strong flower, then we put the pollen out of it and take it on this one, you know. That is a bigger one, but not so strong in the leaves, in the petals.
How long is it going to be, Mr. Lefebvre, before you see the results of what you've just done?
Well, it takes about 5 years to grow from the seed, a bulb, flowering, you know, the first time. It takes about 5 years.
And that's when you'll know whether it's been successful or not.
Well, and then it takes another 10 years to grow about 1,000, and another 10 years to grow about 1,000,000. So it takes about a lifetime.
That's why Mr. Lefebvre keeps these flowers in the safety of his greenhouse. Some of them are worth hundreds of pounds to him. But nearby, there's an enormous public display by the Dutch bulb growers. It's called Keukenhof, which is Dutch for kitchen garden. It got this nickname because the grounds used to be the hunting forest of the local nobleman, and this was where he shot fowl for his evening meal. It's not surprising that this is a favourite place for an afternoon trip out from Amsterdam. The whole park has been beautifully laid out amongst the lakes and trees of the old hunting forest, and each bulb grower in the area provides a display of his prettiest flowers. It's a natural paradise for photographers, and there's a fine old working windmill to see at the top end of the park. But the thing that really is unique about Keukenhof is the smell. It really is just like breathing in perfume. And it's this that brings the people of Amsterdam out here, year after year, to welcome in the spring. returned to the city, there was one other place I wanted to see. Here, too, there was an old windmill, and not without good reason.
The most famous man who ever lived in Amsterdam was a miller's son, although he wasn't a miller himself. He was a painter, perhaps the greatest painter that the world has ever known. His surname was Van Rijn, and his Christian name was Rembrandt. The Dutch are proud of Rembrandt in exactly the same way that we are proud of Shakespeare, because he represents for them the best that their country has ever produced. As a young man, Rembrandt used to come for walks along this stretch of the River Amstel and made sketches of everything that he saw. But at that time, the Dutch weren't interested in buying landscapes, so it was as a portrait painter that Rembrandt van Rijn made his name amongst the Dutch merchants.
This is his portrait of Johannes Ellison. Like most rich Amsterdammers, he wanted paintings of himself and his wife to hang in his canal-side home. It was like having a wedding photo today. Rembrandt's portraits were extremely lifelike. His attention to detail made him famous, and he was soon able to rent a large house in the centre of Amsterdam as his home and studio. Nearby were a number of shops selling curios and antiques. This delighted Rembrandt, for he loved to collect things: costumes of all sorts, swords and pistols, pieces of medieval armour, old manuscripts. He then used them to decorate his portraits, particularly those of his relations. Here, in an old helmet Rembrandt had found, is his brother. In this portrait, his mother is dressed as the prophetess Anna. And this is Saskia, Rembrandt's pretty young wife, as Flora, the goddess of flowers. Saskia inspired his great painting. She was not to live long. After 8 happy years of marriage, she died, leaving Rembrandt to cope with a 7-month-old baby boy called Titus. For a while, Rembrandt found it impossible to paint. He'd lost a loving wife who had been his favourite model. But fortunately, at the time, he was working on a portrait that was larger than anything he'd ever done before. It was a commission from some of the most influential citizens of Amsterdam, and Rembrandt knew that it was the chance he'd always wanted to try out his ideas on a really big scale. So he advertised for a housekeeper for Titus and determined to finish the painting. Today, it's the most precious work of art in all Amsterdam and has pride of place in the Dutch National Gallery, the Rijksmuseum. It hangs in the largest room, for it's 12 feet high and 15 feet wide. It's called the Night Watch. It's a strange picture, nothing like the usual group portrait of the day. It shows the militia company of Captain Frans Banning Kok. He's the tall man in black with the white ruff in the centre of the picture. The militia weren't professional soldiers. They were wealthy citizens who'd volunteered to serve in an emergency, rather like the home guard of Dad's army. But from the start, Rembrandt wasn't satisfied with just painting them. He wanted the portrait to be full of action, so he added a crowd of extras, like the little girl who's running around with a chicken tied to her belt. Instead of painting the men in dignified poses, he showed them all doing something. This one, for instance, is loading his musket. He made other changes. Although it's called the Night Watch, Captain Banning Kok and his lieutenant are standing in bright sunlight. You can see that from the shadow of the captain's hand. You can also see the incredible detail on the lieutenant's coat. The 3 crosses of the Amsterdam crest almost seem to be embroidered onto the canvas. All in all, Rembrandt did everything in his power to make a straightforward portrait into an exciting work of art, and most critics agree that he succeeded. It is a unique painting, full of movement, a masterpiece of light and shade, and 1 million people a year come here from all over the world to see it.
They don't see it as Rembrandt intended, though, because it used to be slightly bigger. Over here is a copy of the Night Watch done by one of Rembrandt's pupils, and this is slightly wider. For instance, on this side, you can see the whole of the head of the man standing behind the drummer, and on the real thing, you can only see half his face. On the other side of the picture, there are 2 figures standing behind the man with the helmet, and they don't exist in Rembrandt's version at all. The explanation is rather sad. Before the Night Watch came to the safety of the Rijksmuseum, it used to hang in the old town hall.
There, it was slightly too large for the wall, so somebody decided to just cut bits off it and threw them away. No one knows today just how much the night watch is worth, but those small bits would certainly fetch a fortune.
After 25 years' work in Amsterdam, Rembrandt was now at the height of his career, famous not only for portraits, but also for his biblical scenes. In this one, The Holy Family at Night, he shows a candle-lit room. You can't see the candle, but you can see the glow he created with his yellow paint. It's a work of genius. But Rembrandt was never as good a businessman as he was an artist, and suddenly the picture business in Holland turned bad. There had been wars against England, and the merchants no longer had money to spend on works of art.
Rembrandt was growing old and finding it difficult to adjust. He still visited the antique shops each week and couldn't stop himself buying the things that he liked, even if it meant borrowing money. He also had the installments on the house to pay, and before long he was badly in debt. In the end, the house and all its contents, all Rembrandt's wonderful collection, had to be sold. It looked as though his career as a painter was over. But there were still two people who loved him very much and were determined that Rembrandt should not stop painting.
The first was the woman he took as housekeeper after Saskia's death. Her name was Hendrikia, and she was a kind, cheerful person. The other was Titus, now a boy of 13. They decided to take Rembrandt in hand and declared they would be partners in the business. They would look after the bills and the money, whilst he could spend the rest of his life painting, with nothing to worry him. This display is part of a special Rembrandt exhibition in Madame Tussaud's waxworks in Amsterdam. It shows Rembrandt in his studio, working on one of his last and most famous portraits, a portrait of himself. Throughout his life, when there was no one else to paint, he always used himself as a model, trying to show how his character was revealed by the glance of his eye or the tilt of his head. These are portraits he made as a young artist. These in prosperous middle age. And finally, as an old man, still studying how time had changed the face he knew best. It was in a quiet street in the shadow of the Westerkerk that he spent his last years, and the same bell that later gave hope to Anne Frank rang for Rembrandt's death. He did keep painting to the end, but he knew how near to tragedy his extravagance had brought him, and he never really forgave himself. Looking back, most people see the time of Rembrandt, of the canal-side houses and the great trading companies, as Amsterdam's golden age. Most of the city churches were built then, and no expense was spared. They were all given a complete carillon of 53 bells. Mr. Licht, who gives recitals each week, allowed me to watch him play high up above the city streets. The keyboard looks a bit like a church organ, with foot pedals for the lower notes, but it needs a lot more energy. It was the wealthy merchants who paid for the carillons. Their trading ventures were so successful that by the middle of the 17th century, Amsterdam was the richest city in Europe. Today, it's one of the smallest European capitals, but it's still one of the most impressive. Modern Dutchmen have a real pride in the great achievements of the past, and yet they're every bit as forward-looking as their ancestors were in the golden age of Amsterdam.